The late Queen carried some deeply shocking secrets to her grave about who was allowed to wear her most sacred personal jewels. She swore certain pieces would never, ever touch Camilla's neck. These items carry stories so heavy and so dark that the monarch trusted only one single person in the entire royal family to inherit them: Catherine. Some of these family heirlooms are downright dangerous. Certain items are so sacred that letting them fall into the wrong hands was something the Queen absolutely refused to even consider. So she bypassed Camilla completely, without a second thought, choosing Catherine every single time. The real reason behind that painful choice is enough to completely break your heart. The vault, the loyal gatekeeper, and the one woman who was never offered the key. She vowed that woman would only touch those precious jewels over her dead body. Those fierce words came from Angela Kelly back in 2005, right after a senior staff member suggested that the newly married Camilla might expect access to the private collection. Kelly stared him down and swore she would never let that happen, muttering that the new bride simply did not deserve any of it. Angela Kelly's official title was Personal Advisor and Senior Dresser to the Queen, but those simple words capture almost nothing of the immense silent power she actually held. Kelly controlled physical access to the most private, fiercely guarded jewelry collection in the entire world. We are not talking about the famous crown jewels locked inside the Tower of London, which belong directly to the state and are managed by strict constitutional protocol. No, the pieces Kelly guarded were kept in locked leather cases and deep velvet-lined drawers right inside Elizabeth's private apartments at Buckingham Palace and Windsor Castle. That secret vault holds over 1,000 individual pieces, and each glittering piece carries a private, highly emotional history that Kelly understands far better than almost anyone else alive. Kelly personally carried those heavy cases from Windsor to Balmoral and back again, protecting them through every season of the Queen's long life. She knew exactly which bracelet Elizabeth reached for on her most difficult mornings, simply because holding those cold diamonds made her feel closer to Philip. Kelly was never just a dresser, she was the ultimate gatekeeper, and in the spring of 2005 that gate was locked tight with one very specific person in mind. That person was Camilla Parker, B.S., the woman who spent the better part of 30 long years as the other woman in Charles's life before finally becoming his official wife. To Kelly, Camilla had not simply joined the ranks of the royal family. No, she had forced her way inside, stepping right over the emotional wreckage of something that Kelly, along with millions of people all around the world, considered a deliberate, unforgivable destruction. Years later, Kelly made those bitter feelings even more painfully specific. She told a highly reputable source that the new Duchess had not built anything there. Instead, she burned something down, and Kelly refused to hand her the family silver to replace what she destroyed. Surprisingly, the Queen never once instructed her dresser to keep Camilla away from the private vault. She never had to. Kelly had spent far too many years reading Elizabeth's heavy silences to understand them just as clearly as any spoken sentence. And the silence surrounding Camilla and that private jewelry collection was easily the loudest, most sustained silence in the entire palace. Camilla, on her part, moved incredibly fast after the wedding. Just weeks after marrying Charles in April of 2005, she did something deeply unsettling. She began the calculated process of establishing herself as a very active senior working royal, which naturally meant identifying exactly which historic jewellery she would wear to represent the crown during official state engagements. So she submitted formal inquiries directly through the proper palace channels, asking to borrow very specific pieces from the Queen's private vaults. Several of these were delicate pearl and diamond pieces that Elizabeth herself had worn during the early years of her reign, treasures that had not been seen in public for decades. Camilla was now constitutionally the new Princess of Wales. She had every single right to expect a response, so she quietly waited. The inquiries landed directly on Kelly's desk, but they never came back. There was absolutely no direct refusal, no explanation, and no alternative offered. Those requests simply vanished into a cold silence, so deliberate and so complete that it served as its own answer, and Camilla understood it perfectly. She had spent over 3 decades learning how to navigate the complicated architecture of this family's quiet disapproval, and this specific silence was absolutely deafening. Camilla absorbed the rejection with the controlled, icy fury of a woman who knew that any public reaction would be completely catastrophic for her fragile public image. She simply wore her own personal pieces to those early public engagements. She smiled at exactly the right moments and locked that burning rage deep down where nobody could ever see it. Charles eventually did exactly what Charles always did when he found himself trapped between his powerful mother and his new wife. He tried to reason with Elizabeth directly. Raising the sensitive issue directly with her, he spoke carefully and diplomatically, but that conversation ended before it could even properly begin. Elizabeth looked at her son with that icy glare that had shut down 1,000 uncomfortable conversations across 70 years of her historic reign. She told him plainly that the collection belonged to her and she would manage it exactly as she always had. Charles walked away from that brief conversation the exact same way he had walked away from so many other tense moments involving his mother, and he never dared to bring it up again. Then came the morning of April 29th, 2011. Finally, suddenly 6 years of bitter humiliation that Camilla had quietly swallowed were laid bare for the entire world to witness. Catherine Middleton stood in her Goring Hotel dressing room as Angela Kelly walked toward her holding the Cartier Halo. Kelly was the very same woman who swore Camilla would only ever lay hands on those royal jewels over her dead body. Now she had to cross the floor and gently settle one of the crown's most priceless treasures onto a commoner's head, with her own hands. Yet the Cartier Halo was never the grandest piece locked inside that dark vault. A delicate, lightweight band featuring 16 graduated scrolls. It sparkled with 739 brilliant diamonds and 149 baton diamonds. The Duke of York bought it for his wife in 1936. Later on, the piece was gifted to a young Princess Elizabeth for her 18th birthday back in 1944. But Elizabeth never chose to wear it in public, not even once. Instead, she loaned it to Princess Margaret and Princess Anne. By the 1970s, the tiara slipped back into the vault, staying completely hidden away and untouched for 40 long years. For the most watched wedding of the entire century, the Queen pulled this specific forgotten treasure out of darkness for Catherine. Her choice was actually a highly protective shield for the new bride. You see, the Cartier Halo had absolutely no ties to Diana. It bore none of the baggage from that bitter, crown-shattering divorce. Not a bit. It was completely clean. In a dynasty where almost every priceless heirloom seems drenched in some historical tragedy or broken heart, offering Catherine a fresh start was the ultimate act of grace from a queen to an outsider stepping onto the public stage. Yet the Cartier Halo was merely the opening scene, because the next jewels Elizabeth selected had zero connection to royal protocol. They were bound to her most intimate, crushing sorrow, the raw diamonds Prince Philip once designed, and the soft pearls of a frightened, youthful queen. But before you can really grasp the immense gravity of the Queen offering Catherine the iconic Edinburgh Wedding Bracelet, you first need to understand the dark history of where it originated. That background story is easily one of the most devastating tales in the entire archive of crown jewels. It starts with the mother of Prince Philip, the tragic Princess Alice of Battenberg. Alice's life was the heavy sort that shatters a person completely, beyond repair. She entered this world entirely deaf, reading lips in 4 different languages simultaneously just to get by, an exhausting feat of pure mental focus and discipline that ordinary people could never hope to match. She married into the Greek royal house, established a household, and raised 5 young children. But in 1930 her own family dragged her to a Swiss asylum against her will, sending her children to different relatives across the map of Europe. Her youngest boy Philip was only 8. For years he bounced between the homes of distant kin who were polite enough but could never heal his quiet, aching loss. He grew up with that hollow, specific loneliness of an abandoned child that nobody really knew how to handle, drifting through borrowed rooms in borrowed houses, while his mother remained locked inside an asylum thousands of miles away. Eventually freed Princess Alice quietly returned to Greece, rebuilding her shattered life just as Nazi forces occupied Athens during the Second World War. There she risked everything to do something that most terrified locals were far too paralyzed with fear to even consider. She concealed desperate Jewish families inside her small apartment, facing a constant looming threat of execution. When German soldiers raided her home demanding to know where the local Jews were hiding, Alice stared them right in the eye, claiming she simply did not understand the question. She was, after all, completely deaf. Alice saved lives without expecting any praise, and when the conflict finally ceased, she possessed almost nothing of value. The only object of real wealth she still owned was a beautiful tiara given to her as a wedding present by Tsar Nicholas II and Tsarina Alexandra of Russia. Just 2 years after presenting that gift, the Tsar, the Tsarina, and all 5 of their children were dragged into a cellar in Yekaterinburg and executed by Bolshevik forces. Princess Alice spent decades quietly keeping this final token from a brutally slaughtered family. When her penniless son Philip came to her in 1947, with his own royal wedding looming, she handed over that historic tiara without a single doubt. Philip carried the heirloom to London jeweller Philip Antrobus to have its precious diamonds pried from their old frame, remaking them into a striking geometric Art Deco bracelet, which he lovingly slipped onto Elizabeth's wrist on their wedding day in November of 1947. Consider what that piece of jewellery actually represented. It was constructed using gems salvaged from a completely annihilated royal dynasty, preserved through the decades by a mother who lost her sanity and almost her life, before pouring her remaining strength into shielding innocent strangers from a horrific genocide, and finally broken apart by a son with empty pockets. He just wanted to give the woman he loved something from the most honest place he had left. Elizabeth wore that bracelet for 73 years, never once taking it off. Every single day of their marriage, that bracelet was somewhere in the room with them. In 2010, Philip travelled to Yad Vashem in Jerusalem. There, his mother had been posthumously honoured as righteous among the nations for sheltering Jewish families in Athens. Standing at that quiet memorial, he was the last living person who had known her before the institutions swallowed her up. He barely spoke. Thousands of miles away at Windsor, the bracelet he had crafted from her last possession sat in its case, waiting. 5 years later, at a state banquet for the President of China in October of 2015, Catherine walked into that grand banquet hall wearing the Edinburgh bracelet glittering on her wrist. The sharp geometric platinum face of the piece caught the light and threw it right back across the room. And every single person in that room who understood what they were looking at felt the massive weight of what Elizabeth had just done. She reached directly into the most private, emotionally charged drawer of her entire jewellery collection. Handing over her husband's handmade wedding gift was never going to be a casual gesture. It was a massive declaration, an irreversible, absolute act of total acceptance. Elizabeth had made her choice, and she made it very publicly, with Camilla sitting right there at the banquet table watching. Can you imagine how that felt for Camilla? She was the Princess of Wales, and she had been Charles's wife for 10 long years by that point. Yet she sat in that banquet hall and watched another woman proudly wear the bracelet Philip had built from Romanov diamonds and the final treasure of his broken, heroic mother. The thick silence at that table must have been its own sharp kind of violence. Then came the Bahrain Pearl Earrings, and with them a layer of dark, forgotten history that almost nobody has ever bothered to discuss. Back in 1947, the Hakim of Bahrain sent Princess Elizabeth a wedding gift consisting of 7 truly magnificent natural pearls. 2 were eventually crafted into elegant drop earrings, Queen Elizabeth wore them constantly throughout the 1950s, and they featured in the famous Dorothy Wilding portraits, the official photographs taken to create the defining image of the new monarch, printed on stamps and distributed to nations across the Commonwealth. But here is what almost no one ever reports about those earrings. Her own mother warned her. She warned her before the wedding that gifted pearls were a terrible omen of sorrow in European royal tradition. They were said to bring nothing but tears and heavy grief to the marriage that accepted them. Elizabeth wore them anyway. She wore them for decades without a single flicker of superstition, and when she eventually placed them into Catherine's hands, she was giving her the exact earrings her own mother had warned would bring deep sorrow into a marriage. Whether Elizabeth had long stopped believing those ancient warnings, or whether she considered Catherine strong enough to carry whatever dark tradition attached to those pearls, is a question that has never been publicly answered. Catherine wears them to grand state dinners, official portraits, and major commemorative events with a consistency so deliberate that it has become its own quiet declaration of royal continuity. The very same gems that framed the face of a frightened young queen are now framing the face of the next one. Elizabeth designed that echo on purpose. Both the Edinburgh bracelet and those Bahrain pearls were Elizabeth's most deeply personal statement of trust. But the personal aspect was only one dimension of what Elizabeth was building, because the next piece she chose to place on Catherine had nothing to do with intimacy. It was about raw, entirely undisguised institutional power, and it came with a colonial history dark enough to make anyone who looked too closely feel deeply uncomfortable. The necklace of empire and the colonial ghost around Catherine's neck. Mir Osman Ali Khan, the last Nizam of Hyderabad, was by some calculations the single wealthiest man alive in 1947. His massive personal fortune included the equivalent of hundreds of millions of dollars in solid gold and silver bullion. Indeed, his private jewelry collection was so obscenely vast that he reportedly used the 185-carat Jacob diamond as a paperweight sitting casually on his desk. That Jacob diamond alone would be worth over $100 million today. The Nizam had accumulated all of this wealth inside a princely state in southern India that operated directly under British colonial protection, which is just a polished way of saying that the British imperial system was specifically engineered to keep compliant rulers incredibly wealthy, extracting maximum possible value from the territories they governed, and ensure that British interests always came first in every single arrangement. When Princess Elizabeth married in November of 1947, the Nizam dispatched a representative to Cartier in London with instructions that were absolutely staggering in their simplicity. Allow the princess to choose absolutely anything from the entire stock, with no financial limit and no cost whatsoever to her. Elizabeth eventually chose a platinum lacework necklace featuring 13 emerald-cut diamonds of absolutely extraordinary clarity. It featured a dramatic, detachable double-drop pendant paired with a pavé-set center that sent bright light exploding across any room it entered. Conservative modern estimates now place its value anywhere between $40 million and $60 million. This easily makes it the single most expensive piece in the private royal collection that does not actually belong to the Crown estate. Now here is the tragic part of this story that almost never gets told. Just 10 months after the Nizam sent that magnificent necklace to Princess Elizabeth, the Indian government marched its military into Hyderabad in a so-called police action, forcibly annexing the entire state in September of 1948. The Nizam's power was completely abolished overnight, and his immense fortune was largely confiscated or frozen solid by the new government. The grand palace that had housed his legendary collection slowly began physically crumbling all around him simply because he could no longer afford its upkeep. The very man who had once told Cartier to let a young princess choose absolutely anything she wanted from their entire stock spent the remaining 19 years of his life slowly watching everything he had built get completely taken apart piece by painful piece. He died in 1967, with almost nothing left intact. His descendants then spent the next 7 decades locked in brutal legal battles across multiple continents, desperately trying to recover the assets that had been seized. One major dispute centered on funds that the Nizam had deposited into a London bank account during the bloody chaos of partition, which dragged through the British court system for 71 long years before finally being resolved in 2019, when a ruling returned those funds to the Nizam's heirs. So let that reality land properly. The priceless necklace that Elizabeth placed around Catherine's neck at the National Portrait Gallery Gala back in 2014 was purchased with the last free money of a man whose entire world was destroyed within 10 months of sending it. The Nizam gave the British Crown one of the most incredibly valuable pieces of jewellery ever created, and the imperial structures that Britain spent generations building then actively helped to dismantle everything else he ever owned. Elizabeth wore the necklace proudly throughout the 1950s, back when the empire was still very much alive, and its dark moral cost had not yet become a subject of serious public debate. But as the decades slowly passed, and the world began looking much more closely at where that kind of colonial wealth had actually come from, Elizabeth quietly returned it to her private vault. Then in 2014, she lifted it out of that vault and placed it around Catherine's neck in front of a room packed with cameras and dignitaries. Now add this fascinating next detail that almost no news outlet reported at the time, and ask yourself whether it really sounds like a simple coincidence. Earlier in 2014, Camilla had made a formal inquiry through an intermediary asking to borrow the Nizam necklace for an upcoming state occasion, but her inquiry received absolutely no response. It was swallowed by the exact same cold silence that had consumed every other request Camilla had directed toward the private collection since 2005. Royal biographer Robert Lacey later referenced this specific inquiry in his research. Just months later, that same necklace appeared on Catherine's neck in photographs that circled the globe within hours. Every single person inside that palace knew the inquiry had been made, and every person inside that palace saw exactly who was wearing the necklace. Catherine stood at that gala with between $40 and $60 million of cold platinum and diamonds resting heavily on her collarbones, remaining perfectly still and perfectly composed, refusing to let a single gram of the bloody history or the immense weight behind that piece show on her face. The Nizam necklace was ultimately Elizabeth's most financially devastating public statement, but Elizabeth had one more calculated move that went far beyond mere money, and it was easily the most personal and the most crushing blow of all. It was a miniature painted portrait of herself, set in a diamond frame that she chose to pin against Catherine's chest while actively refusing to give one to Camilla for as long as she lived. The portrait, the heavy crown, and what the late Queen left behind. The royal family order of Elizabeth II is by far the most intimate and the most secretive honour in the entire British monarchy, and most people have never even heard of its existence. There is no formal committee that decides who receives it. There is no constitutional process, no parliamentary vote, and absolutely no public ceremony of any kind. The sovereign alone decides in complete privacy who is actually worthy. The physical piece itself is a miniature painted portrait of the Queen set in a delicate diamond frame and suspended on a pale yellow silk ribbon. Female members of the royal family pin it proudly to their chest at grand state banquets and diplomatic receptions. What it silently communicates to everyone in the room who understands royal protocol is devastatingly simple. The Queen had personally looked at this woman, considered her very closely, and decided she was trusted enough to carry the Queen's own face pressed against her body. Elizabeth proudly gave this royal family order to Catherine, but she never gave it to Camilla during her entire lifetime. Let that sink in for a moment. Camilla Parker, who was constitutionally the Princess of Wales from 2005 and later became Queen Consort, as the second most senior woman in the entire British monarchy, never once received Elizabeth's personal portrait to wear pinned against her chest. Take Catherine, the wife of the second in line to the throne. One woman got her official constitutional title simply because the cold letter of the law demanded it. The other woman was handed the portrait solely because Queen Elizabeth wanted her to hold it. The massive gulf between those two gestures was anything but subtle. That divide was ocean-wide, and absolutely everyone inside the palace walls knew it. Then came the famous Cambridge Lover's Knot tiara, carrying a dark history of raw psychological damage done to the royal women who wore it long before Catherine ever laid hands on it. Queen Mary commissioned the heavy piece back in 1913, styling it as a replica of a headpiece belonging to her aunt, Princess Augusta of Cambridge. The design is breathtaking, but physically punishing in equal measure, featuring heavy Gothic arches fashioned from glittering diamonds, all set in platinum with 19 massive natural pearls dangling from diamond spikes, swinging wildly with every single movement of the wearer's head. The crushing weight of that heavy platinum frame digs directly into the scalp, while the momentum of those 19 swaying pearls yanks and tears at the hairpins with every painful step she takes. Elizabeth wore it during the 1950s but locked it away almost immediately. A sovereign who needed her full mental and physical strength for heavy state duties simply could not waste hours managing that constant blinding level of physical pain. The infamous lover's knot went completely dark, hidden away for decades. Then in 1981, Prince Charles dragged the piece out of the vault for Diana. What followed is where this sparkling crown's history stops being just uncomfortable and becomes genuinely agonizing to even read about. Princess Diana wore the heavy Cambridge Lover's Knot throughout the 1980s at those tense state banquets and diplomatic galas where she was forced to project absolute grace and poise to the watching world. She stood there in photograph after photograph, smiling beautifully under those heavy diamond arches while her marriage was being quietly shattered behind closed doors. Diana was drowning in a deep, suffocating isolation that was eating her alive. She battled bulimia in private while acting out absolute perfection for the cameras. Her husband was entirely detached, and everyone inside the palace knew exactly where his true attention was focused. In private, Diana actually referred to the lover's knot as her Frankenstein crown. She loathed standing in those gilded palace rooms, smiling under a crown that felt like it was crushing her skull, because that was exactly what royal life felt like every single day. When their marriage collapsed in 1992 and the divorce was finalized in 1996, the tiara was quietly returned to the vault. Diana was dead just 11 months later. William eventually retrieved the piece for Catherine, and as if that legacy was not suffocating enough on its own, a quiet detail surfaced in 2017 that almost nobody reported, and even fewer people actually understood. Royal jewellery historians, analysing extreme close-ups of Catherine wearing the famous lover's knot during a palace event, noticed that at least 2 of the 19 original natural pearls had been damaged or lost. During the painful years, the headpiece sat in deep storage, or perhaps during Diana's time wearing it. They had been quietly swapped out for cheap cultured pearls that carried a slightly different shine from the original jewels. The crown Catherine is wearing today is not the exact same object Diana wore. Pieces of it are gone. Sections have been completely replaced and rebuilt to look unbroken. The headpiece that has become Catherine's most iconic accessory is, in a very physical sense, a repaired object masquerading as something that was never supposed to break in the first place. That parallel to the monarchy itself is far too accurate to be just an accident. Then Elizabeth died in September of 2022, and the entire game changed. The priceless crown jewels kept in the Tower of London passed straight to King Charles because they belonged to the state. But Elizabeth's personal jewellery collection, those locked leather cases and velvet-lined drawers holding between $60 and $100 million of emotionally charged personal jewellery, existed in a legal grey area no one had prepared for. During the tense months after her funeral, Quiet whispers came from royal reporters at Tatler and the Times, revealing how King Charles had ordered an audit of the private vault to decide who gets which jewels going forward. These reports suggested, without ever outright confirming it, that Camilla had raised the awkward topic of dividing the jewels up. She had asked, through the correct official channels, if the historic pieces Catherine had been borrowing on loan for more than a decade should finally be handed over to reflect the shifting hierarchy, with Camilla now ruling as Queen Consort and Catherine stepping up as Princess of Wales. Consider what Camilla was actually claiming with that calculated move. She had waited over 20 long years to get her hands on these boxes, and first time since 2005. There was no fierce gatekeeper like Angela Kelly blocking the wardrobe door, and no Elizabeth quietly deciding Camilla did not deserve a key. This was the exact opportunity Camilla had been patient and calculating enough to anticipate. She struck the moment the coast was clear, but King Charles flatly declined to make any hasty changes. He possessed the sharp political survival instincts of a man who had spent his entire life waiting in the wings. Anyone watching this family close enough knows the truth. Taking Elizabeth's private jewellery from Catherine would ignite a public war that no palace PR team could ever hope to contain. Yet the demand had been formally made, and it was still sitting right there. The famous bracelet Philip had crafted from Romanov diamonds. Those heavy pearls the Queen Mother warned would only bring deep grief, and the necklace bought with the final fortune of a man the empire then tore apart. The tiny hand-painted portrait of a sovereign who had made her personal verdict absolutely clear across 13 long years of highly choreographed public appearances. Every single piece of that treasure was now caught directly between a constitutional queen who had been locked out in the cold for 20 long years and a future queen who spent that exact same time quietly earning every piece she held.